how-to guide to cosmopolitan socialism, a tribute to Michael Brooks. This book was a very long time coming, which to do my necessary mea culpa is 100% my fault. That this is
pandemic played a role also, Ben. Don't worry too much. I had long hair back then, though. It's funny.
Yeah, pandemic. Okay, maybe 5% the pandemic, 95% me. I wrote the introduction to this book, and when you asked me if I'm remembering correctly, this was summer of 2021. So it was like, you got in, I think you'd written a draft of the book at that point. Yep. And you asked me if I'd write an introduction where I talked about, Michael and his views and my friendship with him and all that stuff. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And honestly, I didn't, think it was going to be that hard to do, because I had, the summer before and the weeks after he died, I actually wrote 2 different articles about him, What Michael Brooks Meant to Me, which is the more personal one, and The Cosmopolitan Socialism of Michael Brooks, about his politics. And both of those were pretty easy to write. And what I quickly found when I tried to write this is that the difference a year makes is that it was damn near impossible to force myself to write anything about Michael. And it was like December of 2021. I finally like forced myself to sit down. I remember that was a trip to California, one of the ones before I lived here. I remember sitting at a coffee shop in LA and spending like hours, writing part of an introduction to it, and I hated it, and I threw it out. And like, it was like by the time I turned it in, it was like a year since you asked. So that is on me, but I am really happy that it is out now. Anybody who, if you order this book, there's a Red Emma's link in the description for the episode. For better or for worse, those first 13 pages, the introduction, are probably the hardest 13 pages I've ever had to write of anything ever that I can think of. So
it's the best part of the book. So all that thought and all that reflection, all that time, really, I don't want to say paid off, as that's too crass, but you can definitely feel it when you read it.
Yeah. So yeah, it is definitely a more, I think it's definitely the most complete thing of, I've written about that. There's like, stuff that was left out is largely stuff that's going to have to wait until I can, I don't know, if I write a memoir in 50 years or something, when enough principles are dead, then I'll include
giving myself an argument, a life and analysis.
Yeah. But otherwise, this is the closest to that anybody's getting right now. But the book itself, one of the things. So I said at the introduction, I don't really envy the task you had in writing this, because one of the things that really struck me when I was thinking about this is that Michael Brooks was one of the best verbal communicators in the history of the modern left. He had a real talent for making connections between ideas in conversation or on air in a way that just kind of vividly got you to see where he was going with it. But that's just a very different thing from actually sitting down and trying to pry it apart and be like, okay, well, what exactly is the idea, is the idea here? And there's like a tremendous amount of translation to go from one to the other. This is, this is like, whatever. I'm in awe of how good he was at that, conversationally. Yeah. But it's it's just a very different activity. So, I mean, I think you're very upfront in saying that this is, like, look, this is this is a book by Matt McManus. This is what you got out of it, but it's but I think it's really important work that somebody does, and I'm really happy that you kind of kicked off the project of doing it, because I mean, this is kind of what I was complaining about earlier, about the sort of flattening of a lot of what made him interest in popular recollection of him, that these ideas were really important to him. Like he spent so Michael's book Against the Web, I tell this whole story in the introduction. I spent I worked with him very closely on writing it, which is basically a process where over the course of months, I had many like in-depth conversations that I sort of compare in the introduction to a director when somebody's getting ready to shoot some footage for the movie, saying exactly what he wants for every shot, and and everything. And then the actual process, spend like some days in his apartment in Brooklyn, from like breakfast through like the middle of the night, basically, working and reworking some of these passages with him. And I know that the most important part of that book to him was the last part, which was the vision of cosmopolitan socialism, which is obviously what you're focused on in this book. And so I mean, I can speak to some of what I know he expressed, to me, that, he found important to that, but this is really like, you've produced something that it's like, look, I mean, it's clearly for, this is a very accessible book, but it's, but it's like it's an academically rigorous, like, it's a exploration of ideas. So, I mean, what is that, what does that phrase mean to you, cosmopolitan socialism?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, there are a couple of things I wanted to say about this, which is, first off, like you said, this is a book written by me, not written by Michael. I'm not saying that to try to be jealous at all. I'm just saying it because Michael was irreplaceable, right? I can't write like he can. I certainly can't, express like he could. That was an extraordinary talent, right? So really all I was doing was the best I could to try to pay tribute to that legacy and try to unpack some of the ideas that he laid out in Against the Web and a bunch of different speeches and our own conversations and your conversations while filling in some of the gaps. So I think the book stands on its own and it tries to do this, and I think that people who loved Michael Brooks will probably get something from it in that respect. But I want to make it clear, right, that he was an irreplaceable guy, and this book is a tribute to him at best, right? The next thing that I wanted to say was that to try to really fill in some of the gaps in what he was talking about, there were two steps that I took. The first one is really taking very seriously a lot of the interests and different figures that he and I actually shared. So Michael was a big fan of Amartya Sen and Cornel West. So am I, right? I find them very inspiring figures. And they really added a lot of the meat to the bones of what Michael understood by cosmopolitan socialism. This notion that we need to look at the particularities of people's material existence and try to figure out how to help them. And this is very different depending upon the context, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't be global in our aspirations and recognize the common humanity that unites us all as needy and social creatures, right? And I think that what drew Michael to people like Cornel West and Amartya Sen above all was that Sen and West really demonstrate this kind of cosmopolitan empathy for people, right? That wherever you are, whoever you happen to be in the world, if you are in pain or there's something bad going on in your life, these people will insist that we have a duty to do something about it, right? So that leads to the second thing that I really tried to bring to this book was that Michael unrelentingly stressed this need to be warm, compassionate. I mean, his signature line was, hard on systems, kind to people, right? And so I really tried to adopt that approach when writing the book. Anybody who reads me knows that I can be a jerk, especially, if you're a lazy conservative pundit.
Yeah,
That can be a
let's
pretty
also be real clear on this. Like when Michael said that, be ruthless to systems and kind to people, that was definitely him expressing a side of him and expressing something he cared about, a lot. And, and he was definitely trying to communicate something real, but also, I mean, come on, like on air and God knows off air, the man could be a world-class, hilarious hater. That's it's complicated, but yeah, he so it's not, I mean, I don't want anybody remembering a Saint Michael here, because that's much less interested in the person. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, like, but I think that the larger point is, like, as much as he could enjoy that, was very good at it.
I mean, his impressions of people like Rubin or Peterson were priceless, right? He was the real master at capturing. I can only describe it as like the essence of who these people were at their worst. That's
totally
really funny.
Yeah, absolutely, and the God, yeah, and yeah, I mean, and off air, I mean, he did impressions of a lot of other people too. Which I guess I won't say any, that are going to get anybody who's likely to listen mad. So I'll just say the one, since this was already in Bhaskar's obituary of Michael, that he did this one of Bhaskar Sankara's parents, is there's like, sort of over the top Indian accents, very concerned that their son was, founding a communist magazine instead of like becoming a doctor or a lawyer and making some money. That's like that gives you like just a little bit of a flavor. I mean, there's a lot of this is something I actually about not long after you asked me to do this, actually, I went to a this memorial service that ended up being both for Michael, as like kind of a sort of for people who weren't able to go to the original one because of COVID, and also it ended up being for his dad, who died just before it was going to happen. And originally it was like, felt a little bit weird because I didn't know his dad, that it was like this kind of half of what it was. But I'm really glad that I did. One of the reasons is that I felt like I got some insight into the guy, that he, like, one of the things that stuck in my head is that one of the speakers who was talking about his dad said apparently Michael's dad was just constantly going through life doing impressions of everybody he knew.
Yeah, I picked up on that. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I meant by the sense of empathy, actually, right? I didn't mean to say that he was, Saint Michael or something, and that,
sure,
if
yeah.
you read books, they're solemn affairs. If you listen to him speak, you really felt morally stirred in the way that you would going to church. He was really just a wonderful person to talk to. And I only got to chat with him once on air, although we corresponded and we were always hoping to maybe do something together before he sadly passed. And what really stuck out to me about the guy was both how funny he was, but also how he really felt like he was listening to you and was interested in learning about you as a person. Like, I was normally supposed to be interviewing him about Against the Web for Zero Books, but he almost didn't seem interested in talking about it, right? He was asking me my opinion about things. He wanted to learn a little bit about what made my interest in the book. He asked me questions about the book and what stuck out for me, right? He was a really other-centered guy, which I think is really at the root of a lot of his philosophy.
Totally.
So I wanted to bring a level of that warmth to the book, which is why, as you mentioned, it's definitely more of an academic-y text than it would have been certainly if he had written it, right? But, try to bring that level of
yeah, and like
to it.
Yeah, I mean, there is like a lot of there's I think you feel a lot of that warmth and compassion in Against the Web, and even even with his sort of punching bags, like, one of the things I think people often miss when they're thinking about him is that, look, I mean, he was obviously interested in and very good at like making fun of like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and all these people, but he's actually also really interested in understanding what they were saying and in like sort of trying to see exactly what was wrong with what they were saying. I mean, the segment I used to do on a show, the debunk, was entirely his idea. If you go back, if you go back and listen to, well, I mean, even if you read the chapters of Against the Web where he's going through these IDW figures, like, I think you can tell that he spent a lot of time thinking about them. I mean, this is
Oh yeah.
a thoughtful guy. He doesn't just want to dunk on them, that too, right? But he wants to like understand exactly what they're saying and sort of figure out exactly what's wrong with what they're saying, and ultimately use it as this foil to set up like, okay, here's what not to do, but like, what do we want, right? What's the positive vision? And I think with cosmopolitan socialism, it's like, I mean, one, I think there's a certain sense that he had, like, he would sort of, what he would kind of jokingly refer to, obviously given the phrase, but like he was serious about the idea, as like a third way in the culture war.
Yeah.
By which he meant like, Michael was a huge fan of people, either like Adolf Reeds and Cedric Johnsons and people like that, who really wanted to focus on material issues. But I mean, he also did get that you can't just tell people not to sort of care about culture, or not to, think about it, because it's, where people spend so much of their lives. What you do need is like some sort of reasonable way we can calm all of that down and kind of live together. And I think this is where a lot of the cosmopolitanism comes in. That it's in that sort of real, like, literal sense about, like the way that different kinds of people mingle together in cities and, travel around and all that stuff. That, he hated the idea of cultural appropriation, that like he thought that was just horrendous bullshit. It's like, look, every culture is equally available, like everything is equally available to everybody. Yeah. Nobody's, you don't have to have some sort of like blood and soil connection to something. Like everybody should just be like sort of accessing everything on equal terms. And, and also something you talk a lot about in the book is internationalism, which isn't quite a synonym there, which is why he did end up deciding to sort of stick with the cosmopolitan adjective, but is certainly like an important, element in this mixture.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I wanted to say two things about what you mentioned, which is that I think that his willingness and interest in offering substantive critiques of people like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson really, again, comes from this deep-rooted empathy, right? Where he didn't just want to do what Peterson or Shapiro themselves would do, which is to just dismiss the opposition and not even bother learning about them. He was really keen in understanding what made these guys tick, trying to understand the motivations behind their viewpoints. And I think that really demonstrates fundamentally this very cosmopolitan attitude, because at the root of cosmopolitan, from the Greek word cosmopolis, is this belief that you are a citizen of the world, or that nothing human is foreign to you, as the saying once good. And this is a kind of universalistic curiosity and engagement with humanity wherever it is that you happen to find it, right? And I think that you really see this demonstrated in the breadth and array of his issues, because Michael was engaged by so much, right? Which is, again, why it's such a tragedy that he's gone, because God only knows what would have happened if he was able to connect this all in writing, right? Cornel West and cosmopolitan politics and Marxism and socialism and Taoism and spirituality, right? He was able to make it all feel so seamless, precisely because he really was the citizen of the world and didn't look upon anything human as being foreign to him, the way that so many of us do. And I think one of the things that I really tried to foreground in the book was precisely this third way approach that he took to the endless battles between, should we be, materialists who are really focused on, good, hard Marxist analysis, or should we be committed to identity politics? So there's a section in the book on what David Harvey calls militant particularism, which is basically just identity politics. And I tried to cut out a lot of the chatter. And I really thought, what would Michael say in these circumstances? And what I stress is that, look, there definitely was a problem with some elements of classical socialism that ignored the way that women were discriminated, or tended to dismiss the struggle for racial equality by suggesting that, well, when we move to a classless society, that will all disappear. Sadly, even really heroic people like Eugene Debs could fall into this temptation, right? Gary Dorian talks about this very nicely in his new book on the history of democratic socialism in the United States. And Michael always empathized with this and wanted to make sure that any socialism that we had was inclusive and did take these kinds of struggles seriously. But nobody was better than him, recognizing how a certain kind of woke identity politics could really easily be co-opted by capitalism and turned into really a kind of faux moralism, a very superficial defense of neoliberal individualism and neoliberal elitism evenly. And you saw that very nicely in the clip that we watched before this began, right? Where he talks about how if you're a disappointed, alienated white dude between 25 and 35, and you go and watch one of these centrist websites, or go onto one of these centrist websites, and are just told about how everything sucks and how you need to feel guilty about things, and how if you feel that something's going on in your life, then you should check going wrong in your life. You should check your privilege and not do anything about it. Michael always saw that as being deeply unempathetic and constituted a failure to recognize that people all around the globe, regardless of their background, are exploited and suffer under neoliberal conditions, which is why we need that materialist analysis, and we can't just do identity politics the whole way. So what would have happened if he had had his own opportunity to kind of establish this third way? I'm not sure, right? But I really think that his emphasis on people like West and Sen is indicatory, and it's why I tried to build on people like that to put flesh on the bones for the rest of the book.
Yeah, I mean, with the Sen part of it, you know, my sense was that a couple things were going on there. You know, one is certainly objecting to, you know, militant, you know, yeah, what you're calling following Harvey militant particularism. There's this stuff in the book where he, you know, he talks about CLR James's view that like it shouldn't be strange as him, you know, as like a subject of, you know, somebody from a former colony to you know, to like love British literature because this is like the common inheritance of the human race and all that. But you know, I think there's also this like thread that's been, you know, needle that's being threaded that, in other words, okay, on the one hand, you know, you talk about this in the book that, you know, he wants to avoid sort of Western chauvinism dressed up as universal values. You know, that's like, you know, you don't want to say that like, you know, quote unquote Western culture, and he appropriately makes fun of that phrase given all of its, you know, what we would now think of as non-Western components and influences. I mean, nobody, you know, if you told Plato or Aristotle that they had more in common with you know, barbarians in Scotland than they did with like Egyptians, they would have thought that was very funny. Yeah. But in any case, that's like, you know, look, we don't want to be sort of say, oh, you know, Western culture is better than all the other cultures or anything like that. But at the same time, there's this you know, humanist universalism about values, and part of the way that you know, needle is being threaded following Sen, and I think, you know, a little bit of indirect influence from Rawls is this idea that that look, if universal human rights and universal values are really universal, you should be able to find sources for them in any cultural tradition, and you can. You know, he talks about this in Against the Web. You know, ways that you can find in like the Buddhist tradition, other traditions. You know, like there's a, you know, part of what was important to him about this is this anti-essentialism that's like going back to the earlier part of Against the Web where he's bashing Sam Harris, that says, look, Sam Harris, no less than Osama bin Laden, you know, believes that there's such a thing as true Islam, that there's like the real kind and then like all the non-real kinds. But that's bullshit. Right. There is no such thing. Right. Like this is like cultural and religious traditions are these vast things that include lots of people who are using the particular language of that cultural or religious tradition to express lots of different opposing values. And the ones that we like are going to find a place there. And, you know, you want to have, you know, so it's not actually caring about free speech or human rights, you know, you know, equality for women. It's like, these aren't actually distinctively Western things. There's in every culture, including so-called Western ones, you know, you get people who are both expressing that and the opposite of that, who are, you know, yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you follow Jack Donnelly, who wrote a very interesting book on this, Human Rights in Theory and Practice, the world's first human rights code was introduced actually in Ashoka's India, right, around the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, where Ashoka, drawing very deeply upon reservoirs of Buddhist wisdom, stresses again the universal equality of humankind, the fact that all human beings suffer and die ultimately, and that consequently, because we all suffer and die, the struggle for power after power is quite senseless. And instead, what we should try to do is focus on being compassionate and kind to one another. And from this, he issued his famous edicts, where it calls for religious toleration, dialogue as opposed to violence, and even introduces a couple of positive rights early on, talking about why the state needs to be helpful towards those who are most needy within it, right? So the idea that the West has some kind of monopoly on the notions of universal human rights or universal dignity is completely false, right? But one of the things that I like about Michael is Michael wouldn't sit there and say, just because the West didn't invent these ideas, it shouldn't celebrate them in some way, shape, or form, or they're not the possession of the West.
No.
His point would be to say, look, these people had a very smart idea there. We had a similar smart idea here. Why don't we use that as a jumping off point to talk about the things that unite us, and think about how cool it is that people came up with these different ideas in very different points in history and time, rather than to try to foreground the things that make us different. And this is, again, why I really think he adopted this anti-essentialist stance. So this might be coming because I've read a truly unhuman amount of Thomas Sowell over the last couple of weeks, right? But Thomas Sowell has this famous defense of prejudice that he gives, which is that prejudice may be wrong or right, but it's kind of a shorthand that people make because it's easier to just generalize about entire groups and attribute essential qualities to them than it is to treat each person as an individual, because the cost-benefit analysis of having to treat each person as an individual is too high. So it's way easier just to rely on the stereotypes about you. For somebody like Michael, who is empathetic to his very core, that's not just extraordinarily lazy intellectually. It's a kind of abnegation of our human responsibility to look at the particularities of each individual and each society, and to demonstrate a real curiosity about them, to expand ourselves through interacting with the other. And it's that ethos that is so anti-prejudice and anti-essentialism that I really found extraordinarily resonant reading his own work.
Yeah. So there's a point in the book where you quote something. I'm actually not 100% sure. I think you told me before, but I don't remember where this comes from. I think these are just kind of some notes that he wrote that maybe the family shared with you.
Yeah, his mom shared it with me.
Yeah. So where he says that, hold on, there's I had it before. Let me find it again. Here we go. Yep, this is it. So he talks about four, what he kind of thinks of as like four sort of pillars of the project. Number one, it says anti-essentialism. Essentialism asserts their characteristics all members of a group share, by which they're defined. So anti-essentialism, he's saying, is exemplified by the peerless work of Adolf Reed Jr. and other four real Marxist thinkers. It's a nice little dig there, the four real Marxist thinkers.
Yeah.
I'll leave, as they sometimes say in analytic philosophy papers, figuring out who the other ones are as an exercise for the reader. But in any case, so yeah, Adolf Reed and the other four real Marxist thinkers. 2, internationalism. Not only are we all in this together, the rest of the world has so much to teach the United States. Let's do a reverse shift in power and deeply learn from and cohere with the rest of the world. 3, building a healthy culture. The left has many toxicities that can and often do make it a terrible place to be and not connected to the rest of the world. There's a class critique of this, which scholars like Vivek Chibber describes, and there is a spiritual psychological dimension. Remember, something else that he wrote, some notes that I was sent shortly after he died that he'd written just before, where I remember he used included the phrase we need both Adolf Reed and cosmic consciousness, which I remember thinking is a sentence only Michael Brooks could have written.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But the left needs to learn from and engage in these traditions, and in movements like liberation theology, we need to be able to deal with real human complicity and be good to each other. Which, you know, I mean, look, I'll certainly, you know, that is I think, a lot of people know, you know, I'm an atheist. I've talked about it. I've written about it. Michael used to lightly tease me about it on the show, that, you know, you know, there was a whole sort of running joke about astrology that I think kind of stood in for my squareness about all this stuff. But I actually vibe with this a lot. I think that, you know, as a as a moral worldview, I mean, this is going to sound funny coming from me, but it's true, right? Like, I think that, like, there are elements of Christianity, the sort of acknowledgments of human frailty and belief in redemption, that I like a hell of a lot better than whatever sort of moral worldview too many people on the left often seem to have. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I think this is actually a really important point about how he thinks the left should act interpersonally, right? And I think it's a really good thing that Michael was here to foreground this for us, because one of the things that religion does teach you, for better or for worse, is that personal conduct and interpersonal conduct really matters. And I think sometimes on the left, there's been this real emphasis on always looking at things in terms of impersonal systems. Now, of course, Michael was very capable of doing that, right? Again, kind of people, hard on systems, right? But he also understood that if you relentlessly criticize toxic or bad systems, and yet at the same time you don't behave as a particularly good person in your interpersonal life, that's not a great way to build a political coalition, because people are human beings, and if they don't want to be around you, then they're probably not going to want to politically align with you. And I think that one of the things that Michael really showed, and this is one of the reasons why his death was so mourned, was that being a good person who can make someone else laugh and just seem like a great guy to hang out with really can make a meaningful difference in terms of attracting people in the struggle for justice, right? And that's a spiritual insight in a lot of ways that many religions have foregrounded. And I think there's definitely a way that even an atheist leftist can foreground the importance of that as well.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.